Joining me now, former Arkansas Governor and presidential candidate Mike Huckabee. And, you know, Governor, I got to tell you, I mean, this whole back and forth with the governors on Monday has given many little confidence in President Biden's handling of the pandemic thus far.
Well, Joe Biden spent 4 downs at the line of scrimmage, never even got so much as an inch ahead, and finally had to punt the ball and realize he was going to have to turn it over to the governors because he had no federal solution. Cheryl, the most amazing thing is that I think he had an unexpected and maybe even unintended moment of truth when he admitted that he doesn't have a plan. I'd say it's more fair to say he doesn't have a clue. And that became very evident when he was talking to the governors. Now, this is the guy who for a year has been boasting and beating his chest about he's going to get the virus under control. He's going to handle this. Trump hasn't done it right, but he will. And here we are a year later, more deaths in 2021 than in 2020, more people with COVID. Even with a vaccine and a plan that the Trump administration put in place, Joe Biden fumbled when he got the ball. And I think it's just one of those moments where everyone's going, aha, we knew it all along, but at least Joe admitted it. How it should happen, quite briefly, is that the governors should manage the crisis in their own states. They ought to be coming up with ideas to deal with it. And then the ones that work can be copied and the ones that don't work can be avoided. That's federalism. It's how it's supposed to work. It's the 10th Amendment. And it really is the laboratories of governing that the founders intended.
Well, the one thing I will say, though, is that, you know, there was $49 billion, Governor, in the American Rescue Plan from earlier this year. That money was allocated. They barely spent half of that. If I can tell you where to spend a few $1 billion, why don't you order those tests and get them to people? Because they gave you that idea back in October, and you didn't do it. So that's one issue. But I want to move on to the kind of the midterms in 2022, because all of this has become politicized for next year. Politico is getting blowback this morning because they published an article that warned that Republicans are making local school board races partisan. That article accusing Republicans of politicizing school board races just to gain political ground in 2022. And you've got the school district of Minnesota that wants to give extra pay to non-white teachers who can then mentor other non-white colleagues, and many are calling that basically segregation. So I want to get your kind of take on what all of this means for November of 2022.
Well, to quote a very prominent Democrat, Tip O'Neill, all politics is local, and we are seeing it now. The Virginia governor's race was basically decided because people recognized that there were people on the left who didn't think parents had any role or responsibility in their children's education. And essentially the message was, sit down, shut up, and hand your kids over to us. We'll let you know what we've done with them. This is not a battle, really, though, between Democrats and Republicans as much as it is a battle between statism, which is collectivism, classic Marxist thought, and individualism, where people are free to make their own decisions and parents are free to determine what's going to be put into their children's heads. So rather than this being a horizontal left-right issue, I really see it more as a vertical issue, up and down. And people are going to have to decide, do they believe that government is the answer, or do they believe that the real answers day to day fall within their own choices, beliefs, convictions, and their freedom? That's really what's at stake right now.
I will say, though, look at what happened in Virginia with Governor Youngkin, or, you know, that race anyway, Terry McAuliffe. I mean, that was about education. Who thought that education was going to be an issue that was going to change the course of a governor's race?
Well, I think a lot of us realized it because it often drives races at the state and local level. You don't get any closer to people's personal passions than when you're messing with their children. And whether it's the kind of books they're forced to read or what movies they're not allowed to watch because, you know, they are steeped with systemic racism, so they can't watch things like To Kill a Mockingbird, which is the most anti-racist movie probably in the last 100 years. So when people start messing with the children of citizens, that's when parents start showing up at school board meetings unhappy. It's frankly the best sign of a healthy government when people take to the streets and they go to meetings and they stand up and they speak up and they say, we've had it up to here, no more, and we're going to start running for these offices that you guys have been holding and frankly messing up for a long time.
Yeah, no, it's really going to reverberate next year. Before I let you go, I do want to ask you about this call that President Biden's got coming up today with Russian President Putin. This came from Putin's office. He's the one requesting the meeting, and all of this is over Ukraine. What do you make of what's playing out right now there?
I don't think we ought to be naive. Putin is just sort of feeling out just how far he can go, what he can get away with. And I think he's pretty well convinced himself he can get away with whatever he wants to because he's not afraid of what Joe Biden or his administration will do. He watched the botched exit and withdrawal from Afghanistan. He realized that Biden is really more interested in the military being woke and diversified than effective. And I think Biden is going to be taken advantage of by Putin. Putin's going to play him like a cheap fiddle. And it's a dangerous situation if Putin decides he's going to go ahead and push forward in Ukraine. And I think he feels that if he does, there'll be a little bit of an economic sanction, but basically no big deal.
Yeah, well, the thing is, and I said this earlier in the show, if President Biden and Vice President Harris think that the biggest issue right now, besides climate change, is the threat on democracy, well, then maybe you ought to be a little better in your handling of the Ukraine-Russia situation, Governor. So that's just my take. Governor Mike Huckabee, Happy New Year. Great to have you here. All right, we've got additional